We can't hear you. Are you muted or is it our end? Like a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, very good.
Hold on. I'm going to put, well, so do you know what just happened?
I don't.
I haven't seen my daughter in 6 months because she goes to university in Amsterdam, and she just did a surprise. She just walked through the door.
Oh, I love that.
So I was screaming. I was like, ah!
You know, I did that. That is so cute. I did that when I was studying at Cambridge and I flew home unannounced.
Yeah.
I think for Easter. And I was sitting in the living room with my parents with a clown mask. My sister brought me a clown mask. I was out there with this giant rubber clown mask over my head.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
It's ridiculous now. How cool. Well,
Yeah.
with you.
Sorry?
How long will she stay?
Oh, just till Sunday. I mean, she'll come back probably at some point, but for Easter and stuff. But I just hadn't seen her for quite a long time. So, I mean, since Christmas, it's not that long ago. But anyway.
So, thank you, and thank you, You know how great.
Oh, please.
And they have heard. I'm going to give you a quick look at the class because there are about 50 students, as you might remember. They tend not to sit right in the center, so it looks like you're speaking to an empty room, but you are not.
It does.
They are scattered all over the place. I have been singing your praises and introducing you for weeks, really since the first day of the semester. So I'm not eating up any of your time to do that today. They are heard it. They know how lucky we are to have you with us today.
Stop saying that. I'm lucky to be speaking to you guys, and I can't wait for the Q&A bit. So
that they are the luckiest students at Stony Brook this semester. I tell them all the time. So just as a reminder, because I know with all the speaking you do, you may forget what audience you're in front of from day to day. But this is an undergraduate course. These are mostly history majors, although there are a handful of econ majors and some other scattered majors. The course is the ideologies of capitalism. We spend a lot of time talking about, the ideologies of capitalism, but the tensions between competing narratives and capitalism in crisis, and if so, why? And can it be saved and should it be saved? And I know that you're going to be the perfect person to take us through a lot of this. They heard from Nick Hanauer last week. So in a lot of ways, this is the perfect kind of, in a sense, a bit of a continuation, but with enough of a departure to be very different. So thanks again.
Amazing.
All right.
Right. So sorry, I was just adding a slide while you were talking. Do you ever do that when you should actually be cutting slides? Right. So let me just share my screen. This is the dangerous bit where you risk showing people not only your emails, but strange pictures of your family. So it has to be done extremely carefully. And Stephanie, just remind me how many minutes I should speak for before before we engage with each other. I'm going to put a timer on.
Like 40 to 50 minutes.
Perfect. So timer's on. That way I don't blab for too long. So first of all, thank you guys for inviting me. I'm lucky. You're not lucky. These are always amazing moments to, think together. Do you see my screen? Do you see a cover slide? Yes. I couldn't hear. Yes. Okay, fantastic. Good. So I'm going to be mainly speaking to you about this book I've just written, which is about how we have to absolutely redesign our economy if we're interested in meeting important goals, especially, but not only the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, there's 17 of them since 2015. Every country, including the United States, has signed up to them. But they're literally just blah, 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 as Greta Thunberg often says about climate change, because unless we can redesign our economic system to deliver on those goals, not only is it a missed opportunity, but it's a complete falsity. And it's better not even to have them than pretending that we're going after them. And of course, Stephanie's work is so important because, or Professor Kelton, I don't know how you guys call her, because her work is all about how there's these false constraints, of course, on money, and we think that finance is just there to grease the wheels of commerce, and then we create sort of false constraints in the system based on notions as though you need tax revenue in order to go out there and do important things like fund public education. And I'm sure you've heard from her why that's a false narrative. My work has tried to debunk, through different books I've written, especially the entrepreneurial state, the false narrative about where innovation comes from. And given that innovation is actually the key driver of growth in capitalism, which is, not a natural system, it's a system that's been around for about 250 years. But before that was feudalism, 500 years of inertia, not much happened. So innovation is a key driver of growth in capitalist economies, but also, if we misgovern it, also a key driver of inequality in capitalist economies. For me, it was really important to kind of highlight how little we understand about where innovation comes from. And I'll put some of that in the talk, because that's more from my 3 books ago, The Entrepreneurial State. But what I really want to focus on today in the limited time we have is this kind of sense of urgency, right? We go literally from crisis to crisis to crisis, financial crisis, the climate crisis, the health pandemic. Now we have a geopolitical crisis. And unless we actually have tools to govern our system in a proactive way and not a reactive way, not only will we continue to go from crisis to crisis to crisis, but we will continue to be incredibly, dramatically, tragically, criminally unprepared each time. So with the COVID-19 crisis, you don't need me to tell you just how unprepared we were. Literally, countries across the globe had such a hard time doing really basic stuff like personal protection equipment, masks and gear for hospital workers who we called essential workers, but failed to prepare them and arm them for being on the battlefield, on the front lines of the battlefield while we were all locked down in our homes. That was tragic. And in many countries, what was interesting, like in Italy, where I'm from, we found ourselves, even though I live in London and grew up in the US, too much information there. Anyway, we found ourselves in Italy completely dependent on Chinese personal protection equipment. 100% of PPE was produced in China, and none of it was produced in Italy. What was interesting was then that in a very quick amount of time, Italy had to kind of rethink some of its tools. I'm going to keep coming back to the fact that we need to redesign our tools in order to tackle our goals. But it actually took a crisis like COVID-19 to force Italy to change how it does public procurement, public purchasing, in the same way that the US government implemented its Defense Production Procurement Act, which it set up after the Korean War in order to quickly deliver on really important things, from vaccines to test and trace to PPE equipment. And Italy, in a very short amount of time, became 100% independent of Chinese PPE, producing its own through 139 different types of companies. But that is not the normal way we do things. We tend to think that somehow the market's going to solve the problems and we can just sit there and kind of fix different types of market failures along the way. We don't actually ask ourselves, what kind of tools do we need to deliver on the kind of goals that we have, which in this case was make sure that every frontline health worker actually has PPE. Or with the vaccine's not the goal. Vaccinating everyone in the world is the goal. And both Professor Kelton and I are on the World Health Organization Council on the Economics of Health for All, which I chair, and very much at the center of that council is reflections on COVID-19. The idea is, if health for all is the goal, so vaccinating everyone, backtrack and ask what it means for the finance that's created for it, but also how we design intellectual property rights, which unfortunately continue to be tools for value extraction in the economy. And I tend to focus a lot on that problem around patents. Patents are often too upstream in the innovation process, so the tools for research are getting patented and privatized. They're too wide because they're used for strategic reasons. They're too strong, hard to license. That's all due to decisions we've made. And there's a great book, by the way, on issues of legal and contracts and patents by Caterina Pistor at Columbia University. It's called The Code of Capital, which if you haven't read it, I really recommend it. But anyway, COVID-19 moment, massive tragedy, massive unpreparedness at every level, digital divide. So the kids who were locked down, the students who were locked down globally had very different levels of access to their human right to education. All different examples of just how badly prepared we were in terms of our real structures on the ground. And of course, we've been shown to be incredibly unprepared around climate change. Literally half an hour ago, I was giving a talk to the government in British Columbia, which you'll know has been undergoing just climate symptom after climate symptom. So floods and fires, they had this heat dome, but also that month before COVID-19 became a household word. You'll remember the floods in Venice, which is the part of Italy where I'm from, the fires in Australia, the fires in the wildfires in California. And what's incredible is that you'd think, as Greta Thunberg says, when your house is on fire, what do? Do you sit there and debate? Should I stay? Should I go? What should I do? You get out quickly. And if you look at all the statistics, we've hardly gone out quickly from this. This is mainly some European data here, but we continue in the United States and in Europe and globally to subsidize a sector which we know is part of the problem. And even during the COVID-19 recovery funding period since 2020, something like 56% of the COVID-19 recovery funding allocated to energy companies has actually gone to fossil fuel projects. So hardly a moment of, quick and urgent change making. And the problem is that if we just react to these crises, the financial crisis, the climate crisis, the health crisis, and so on, we're just treating the symptoms. So it's really important to remember that the economy itself is an outcome of all sorts of decisions we make, and really going to the heart of some governance issues, how we govern our public institutions, how we govern our private institutions, and how we govern their interrelationships is really key. And in terms of your course on history of capitalism and thinking about capitalism, I don't know if you're reading Carlo Polanyi, but I was personally very, very influenced by his book, The Great Transformation, because he argues that, even just the conception of the free market is not only kind of false in the sense that I'm sure you've also read, so someone like Adam Smith talked about the free market not as free from the state, but free from rents that actually block all sorts of value creation, in the same way that the physiocrats before Adam Smith looked through the tableau économique at all the rent seeking, all the extraction in the economy that was kind of holding it down. But Polanyi did something really interesting, was he tracked the history of the evolution of the market mechanism in the history of capitalism, last 300 years, and showed it would have never happened without actually a constant kind of administrative watch on the system. So in some ways, the market itself was an outcome of state activity, right? So it's not only the kind of falsity around how we interpret Adam Smith, because he didn't say the free market was free from the state, but it's also the historical evolution of the market itself was very much an outcome of that constant watch on the system and making the market actually work in the ways that would also be more structured and so on. But of course, the kind of market outcomes we get, whether we actually end up with an unsustainable, production system which is killing our planet, whether we end up with the massive amounts of inequality that we have globally, it doesn't have to be like that. There's, different ways to do capitalism, different ways to do markets. Markets are outcomes. There's no such thing as the market pressure forcing, companies to misbehave and so on. So just quickly, before I get onto the mission economy points, when I, often talk to people, I say, before even talking about what policy should do, let's just be really frank about where the sickness is. Just like a doctor curing you, he better understand the causes of your illness before he's treating or she's treating the symptoms you have. So I'm just going to quickly, and forgive me if this is a bit superficial, but just go through a bit of the kind of sickness, causes of the sickness in our current state of doing capitalism, which are important to reflect on before we look at some solutions in this kind of what I'll call a mission-oriented approach. And coming back to this point that it's a outcome of the decisions we make in our institutions, I'm going to look at three types of institutions: finance, business, and the public sector. So first of all, finance. I wrote a whole book about this called The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy. And this is one of the figures from that, so apologies if it's a bit outdated. But basically, what we know about the financial sector globally is that it's been very good at financing itself. So finance, finances, finance. And by the latter word, I mean finance, insurance, and real estate, which broadly defined can be seen as the financial sector. And you see this when you look at figures like this one from Andy Haldane. He was the chief economist of the Bank of England. He's also a good friend of mine. He showed how in the UK, but this figure is, this figure is for the UK, but it's actually very similar in the US. financial intermediation as a percentage of real gross value added has been outpacing the growth of the rest of the economy. And, that would be fine if it was actually, the money through financial intermediation found itself fueling growth in the so-called real economy. Instead, it's been financing to a large extent, as I mentioned, different bits like insurance and real estate, and the fact that so much finance has gone, for example, into mortgages and different types of lending at the same time that real wages haven't increased. Even during COVID-19, to help people, the government and governments made it easier for people to buy homes, which is like, why are you just piling on debt onto people instead of making sure that, we have different policies that increase their wages so they can actually buy stuff without all that private debt. So just making it easier to buy things when the prices of the homes weren't necessarily falling, but also their real wages weren't necessarily increasing. This has increased the kind of financial bubble behind real estate. And also in some countries like the UK have caused private debt, forget public debt, which everyone obsesses about, private debt to escalate again to the level it was before the financial crisis. So the ratio of private debt to disposable income is again extremely high. And when you kind of burst that bubble, we will have potentially another crisis. But no one's talking about this. It's kind of hidden in the back pages of newspapers, if at all. Second, business itself has become financialized. So to a large extent, profits that are made in the real economy are not then reinvested back into the real economy through, say, new technology, human capital formation, and so on. But to a large extent, they're being used just to boost share prices. So a financial metric of growth rather than a real one. So in the last 10 years, the largest 500 companies have spent over $4 trillion, that's 12 zeros, on just buying back their own stock to boost share prices, stock options, and executive pay. Now, if you talk to companies who are doing that, like I often do, and say, why are you doing that? Why are you spending so much just on repurchasing your stock? They say, oh, it's because there's no opportunities for investment. And then you look at the ones that are doing most of that buyback, like in energy, Exxon, or in health, Pfizer, which now everyone knows about Pfizer because of the vaccine, but I've been ranting against Pfizer for quite a while. It's one of the most financialized companies. It spends more in share buybacks than in R&D. Of course, there are opportunities in these sectors, but the fact that they might also expect government to finance a lot of those opportunities, and on the back of that, they come in and do some of the easier bits downstream, and also are allowed to patent the outcomes of that innovation and charge whatever price they want, because we don't have a proper pricing system in areas that, well, in many areas, but also in these areas which are collectively created through both public and private finance. All of this is a huge problem in the system. But even just this number here, the $4 trillion spent to just buy back shares as opposed to reinvesting it back into new productive capacity is a huge problem. And you see it, by the way, also in terms of falling business investment. So that lack of reinvestment back in, you can see it in terms of the share of business investment as part of GDP has been on trend falling. And it's interesting to ask what the consequences of this are. You might have heard that there's debates about how robots or artificial intelligence are a danger to jobs and skills and wages. Well, that's not really true, because technological change for the last 200 years has been labor displacing, right? New machines, industrial revolution, since the times of David Ricardo, when he was writing about it, have in fact been displacing labor. But as long as profits generated from this kind of technological revolution, growth, et cetera, was reinvested back in, new jobs appeared, new sectors appeared, new skills were needed. When from the 1980s, and I don't know how much you've looked at this in the course, but since the 1980s, there's been a lot of this ideology of just maximizing shareholder value as a good thing to do, through textbooks literally being taught at Harvard Business School, through people like Michael Jensen. Bill Lazonick has written a lot about this problem. That is what causes a lot of the labor displacement. So once the profits being generated by technological change are not reinvested back in, that can cause a lot of this kind of structural unemployment, as opposed to that kind of creative destruction, which we saw before. New technology displaced labor, some places then fell in terms of employment, in terms of sectors being displaced by other sectors. But as long as there was that creative destruction of profits reinvested in the economy, new jobs appeared. But again, something that a lot of people don't talk about. And this problem is looked at or talked about sometimes, even by the business community, which reflects on why we need a different form of capitalism. Larry Fink here, who you see, the guy on the left there, the head of Goldman Sachs, often every year, he just did this 3 weeks ago, writes a letter to his shareholders saying, oh, we need to change. We can't just focus on shareholder value. We need to do stakeholder value, and we need to give back to communities and to workers. But this is, until it's just fluff, like nothing changes. Besides the fact that did I say Goldman Sachs? I meant to say BlackRock. BlackRock is a major shareholder in Fox News, not exactly a source of democratic capitalism, but also, this notion of stakeholder value hasn't really transformed anything. It's not especially transforming how different actors in the system actually work together, whether it's on vaccine production, whether it's on issues around digital algorithms, which we know from the revelations of Frances Haugen and Facebook are a huge problem. So all these different sectors like energy, health, and digital, where you have public and private both really active, what would a stakeholder value, not a shareholder maximization value, production system, innovation system look like? Currently, the talk around this doesn't address that at all. And I'll come back to that at the end. But the real issue that I've kind of focused on a lot of my work is not just about finance, which I talked about, not just about business, but also about government. Governments themselves are stuck. And they're stuck because of the ideology, in some ways, of what government is for. It's not just the Reaganite and the Thatcherite idea of government get out of the way, but even the more progressive notion of what government is for is sort of stuck in this idea that government at best can fix market failures. So in this very un-Polanyi-esque kind of view, the idea that the market is out there, every now and, it's the best way to organize our capitalist system, as though it's some sort of natural universal mechanism. Now and then it'll screw up and need the government to come in and put a bandage here or there. That's part of the problem. So the idea is that the market fails either because we have positive externalities, so not enough investment in areas that produce public goods, like basic research and development, clean water. So government has to come in and fix that by investing in it. The opposite would be negative externalities. The private sector is doing too much of something that is not accounted for in its cost structure, so it continues to do too much of it, like pollution. So government has to come in and fix that problem by introducing something like a carbon tax, or information asymmetries, what Joe Stiglitz actually got the Nobel Prize for. Because we have that, then maybe small companies don't get enough lending, so government comes in and fixes that problem through SME finance. So the idea that government is always patching up the system, literally filling the gap of what the private sector is not doing, or putting a bandage on something it's doing too much of, is what I think is hugely problematic in terms of allowing us to transform our systems towards actually achieving really important goals, coming back to the Sustainable Development Goals, coming back to the issue of climate change, coming back to the issue of strengthening our health systems to make them ambitious, strong, and capable, but also in terms of transformational growth, coming back to the finance question. If we have a country like the UK that is driven by consumption-led growth, that is fueled by private debt, very much similar to the US, actually, you need a transformation of consumption-led growth to investment-led growth, first of all, and secondly, to transform that investment in both the private and public towards solving big climate and sustainable growth challenges. That's not going to happen by tinkering, on the sidelines with bandages. So it's not that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it's a very limited approach, which literally means that we're always kind of too little, too late. And I'll share these slides with you, but this one here is a bit too busy. But it's basically just, and sorry if it's a bit messy as well. just looking at that kind of history of why we've gotten so stuck with thinking about the government just as at best fixing market failures. And I look in this, this is based on a short paper I wrote, which I can also send you, which is how a lot of the training of the civil service, people who work in government, has been fueled by kind of public choice theory and new public management, which is basically convinced civil servants not only that market failure theory is the way to, formulate government policy, but that government failure itself is a huge problem, and it's even bigger problem than market failure. So, kind of do your thing, correct the market failure, and then be very aware that you might get corrupted and captured along the way. So take up as little space as possible and then get out of the way. And it's not that capture and corruption doesn't happen. I'm from Italy, believe me, it happens. The mafia itself was set up because of that, which if you're interested, I can tell you more about. But this idea that we actually design government policy to be so fearful that government failure might be even bigger than market failure, or that at best you can fix a market failure problem, is very much, I think, at the heart of some of the structural deficiencies in how we design policy. So I'll be speaking to you in the rest of my time about the kind of solutions that I see around redesigning policy towards being kind of outcomes oriented, solving big problems and backtracking on what it means for the tools in a much more proactive, mission-oriented way. But just quickly, how I got to that was kind of through a path of first writing these other two books, The Entrepreneurial State, where I looked at all the different investments that were required to make our smart products, your smartphone, your iPhone, smart and not stupid. Well, it came out of public money, right? So internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri were all funded by public institutions. Like the internet came out of DARPA, GPS came out of the Navy, touchscreen display came out of the CIA, for God's sakes. My God, check your fingers next time you put your finger on your phone. And yet we don't use the word entrepreneurship to talk about, government activity or risk-taking, uncertainty, experimentation. We use that to talk about venture capital, which presents itself. Nick Hanauer is a venture capitalist who you spoke to. We don't recognize that actually there's entrepreneurial systems that need to be in place, not just entrepreneurs in a garage, in order to really foster the most radical innovation we've seen in capitalism. And by dismissing the role of the state, as I just mentioned, as a market fixer, we just tell not only a very wrong story about kind of who did what and dismiss completely the kind of public funding behind internet and so on, but that also then affects who gets what, right? So who gets what in terms of the division of profits, wages, interest, rents, but also in terms of public and private returns. It's influenced by the stories we tell of where value creation comes from. So that first book for me was really important in just revealing the history behind green technology, health technology, and the internet and kind of the digital technology, revealing that actually was purpose-oriented, mission-oriented government institutions that got us a lot of the technology, which then companies like Apple, very smartly, they should be praised for it, put together in funky objects like our iPhones. But Apple would have had nothing to put together in anything had there not been that public funding. In this other book on the value of everything, I look at the theory of value, not only that we've had in the history of economic thinking, but that we should have to reflect that collective value creation, which has led to the kinds of innovations we all take for granted. And what does it mean to explicitly then foster that collective intelligence, to also render our public institutions more capable to play that role, also the private institutions, but especially what does it mean for how they share the rewards of that in a more equitable way. And I look at how value extraction, unfortunately, through rent seeking, whether it's through intellectual property rights or how we design our financial system, doesn't help in actually fostering that collective value creation that's also good for long-run growth, sustainable growth, and so on. But I unpick the kind of problematic theories of value that need to be debunked in order to explicitly understand and theorize about collective value creation. And anyway, mission economy, what I do is I go back to the moon landing 51 years ago now. Actually wrote it when it was 50 years ago. And ask, how could it be that we're so stuck, coming back to my first slides, can't even do PPE, and yet we went to the moon and back in such a short amount of time, 51 years ago, when governments, but also lots of private sector actors, because it wasn't just government, worked together in a super ambitious way. And literally did the outcomes-oriented budgeting that Stephanie believes in, redesigned procurement, redesigned the contracts so that government and business could truly work together towards solving an incredibly difficult goal, which was not only to go to the moon, but to come back. And I ask what it means for those three issues that I just raised, especially in terms of business governance, government governance, not about fixing market failures, but much more actively shaping and co-creating markets, and what lessons we can learn for today in terms of moving forwards. And this Mission Economy book is a much more kind of recipe book. I'm Italian, so as Stephanie knows, we're often competing on Twitter on who cooks best. I think I won that one, Steph. Just kidding. Anyway, so what's striking about the moon landing is just how explicit Kennedy was, but NASA was, on how hard it was going to be. And part of this ideology that government is there just to fix market failures has also translated into a certain way of speaking about government that's completely different from how Kennedy spoke about the moon landing. He said, we're going to do it because it's hard, not because it's easy. We might screw up along the way. It's going to require lots of experimentation, but it's worth it. That trial and error is worth it. And yes, it's going to cost a lot of money, but it's important. And in parentheses, he said, by the way, less than what we spend on cigars and cigarettes every year. But still, yes, it's going to cost money, but it's important. So, what was important, of course, was the Sputnik race, beat the Russians kind of challenge that the US set itself. But had they just stopped at beat the Russians, it wouldn't have happened, right? So really transforming this goal or this challenge, the Cold War challenge, into a concrete mission where you could actually answer yes or no. Did you achieve it? Did you get to the moon and back? Did you do it quickly within one generation? Did you embrace uncertainty, experimentation? Were you able to create the funds to kind of go after that challenge? And when he set that challenge back in 1961 and then 63 mainly, they had no idea how to get to the moon. They finally landed on this lunar orbit rendezvous, but it definitely required a lot of that kind of experimentation, which we don't allow in governments. As soon as a civil servant, a public servant makes a mistake, think of the Solyndra example, which if we have time we can talk about in the Q&A. It's front page of the newspapers. So lots of mistakes, and in fact the Apollo 1 fire, huge problem. 3 astronauts died. Gus Grissom, one of those astronauts, before dying said, Jesus Christ, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because they couldn't hear what was being said to them in mission control room on that simulation day, when then there was a tragic fire which burned them alive. And on the back of that fire, in terms of this kind of learning by doing, experimentation, they changed the whole structure of NASA. They changed the bureaucracy. It went from being very vertical to much more horizontal, with project managers, each with their teams, but in constant communication one with the other, reflecting on this point, that Gus Grissom said, we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings. So this ideology that government in capitalism is boring, it's bureaucratic, it's slow, it's inertial, it's vertical, it's departmental silos, is, that's true if we decide to structure our bureaucracy that way. But it's not true if we decide to change our bureaucracy to be more creative, more dynamic, more agile, more flexible. Just like large companies, when they become too large and bureaucratic, they might decide to, change their structures. That's what happened in General Motors and in General Electric through the multi-divisional company 50 years ago. Anyway, so this was quite interesting, and they had to work with lots of different private sector companies. It wasn't just NASA doing its thing in aerospace. They worked with companies around nutrition, materials, electronics, the whole software industry. You might have seen Hidden Figures, which showed how many Black American women were at the heart of innovation in software. They were actually called computers. They were doing the computing. That was very much an outcome of this incredible mission that had lots of different homework problems along the way, which created then as spillovers camera phones, athletic shoes, foil blankets, scratch-resistant lenses. But these spillovers that happen along the way that created huge amounts of value, in the economy, didn't just happen because they said it should happen. It was almost designed into the system. So the tools like procurement, which is government as purchaser, because government through NASA had to purchase a lot of some of the solutions, it didn't do everything itself, was designed, redesigned to foster those spillovers along the way, to foster experimentation, to foster innovation. So one of the first things that this guy, Ernest Brackett, the head of procurement, did was to change procurement from being cost plus, which was basically government just paying for any kind of costs that the private sector procuring in solutions would charge government for, didn't create a lot of innovation, and government found itself just paying very hefty fees. They changed it to fixed price, like with a target, like a challenge fund, with incentives for innovation and quality improvement. They also designed into the contracts this nifty idea of no excess profits. So not no profits, that would be charity or philanthropy, and you don't get to the moon through charity. You also don't solve the vaccine problem through charity. We need production systems, innovation systems, collaboration between different actors, but they said no excess profits. In other words, let's not turn this into a gambling casino. So just that care to the contract, coming back to my point about, contracts are decisions we make on the deal. We negotiate these deals, but if the deal is the wrong deal, like I think patents are often written with very bad deals, then that affects what actually happens in the real economy. And they also, this to me was fascinating. I'm actually writing a whole book about this, the history of consulting and what it's done to government capacity. They were very clear that government itself needed a brain, otherwise it wouldn't even know who to work with in the private sector or even how to write the terms of reference. So very counter in some ways to public choice theory and new public management, which has, as I mentioned before, been almost a trickle down thinking from neoliberal kind of Chicago school kind of thinking of the state. They instead realized that they needed to invest in really dynamic capabilities within their own institution, not only to guide their investments, but to even know how to partner well with which private sector companies and so on. And yes, it did cost a lot of money. In today's figures, 300 billion, well, much less than Biden's infrastructure plan, but also much less than a lot of wars that we've fought, than the financial bailout. At the time, it was about 30 billion. But really what created that kind of multiplier effect, if you think of Keynes's multiplier, was that this was very ambitious money, which created spillovers across the economy, which then created all this kind of new forms of technology, collaborations, and so on. So it's not so much about the money that was spent, again, 30 billion or 300 billion in today's terms, but the catalytic effect it had in terms of, creating that additionality in the system across all those different sectors. And so the last part of the book says, Jesus, if we could do it going to the moon and back 51 years ago, really, really hard thing. Why are we so bad at kind of, thinking through our organizational structures, the contracts, the ambition, the willingness to experiment, the money creation, when it's about social concerns, when it's about poverty, hunger, racism, health and well-being, quality education, gender parity. These are seen as like, oh, that's just like, for social services. That's for someone else to kind of fix the mess. We just need to create value and innovation in the system over here and worry about social concerns somewhere else. Whereas what I think this mission economy kind of message is it just depends what we consider as urgent. He said, yes, it's going to cost a lot of money, but, and yes, it's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy, but we need to embrace that difficulty together, embrace the uncertainty, the experimentation, the learning by doing. Along the way, we don't treat these social problems with the equal amount of urgency, but that's a decision we make. And I think coming back to my first two slides, the fact that climate change is, in most people's, not all people's, perception, an urgent problem. Again, I was speaking today with the British Columbia government and a big conference where they've experienced, floods and fires and, massive problems that are symptoms of climate change. They sense that urgency, but how to redesign our system industrial strategy, innovation policy, budgeting, procurement, public-private collaborations to deliver on that urgent kind of goal. This is what I try to bring to the table through this mission economy thinking. And I was very lucky to have been asked to work closely with the European Commission on this. So I helped them redesign their innovation policy away from just blabbing on about inclusive growth, sustainable growth, but turning their challenge-oriented thinking towards missions that were bold and inspirational, that require many different sectors to work together, like the moon landing did. It was not just aerospace, as I've said, but especially all these little bubbles on the bottom are about how do you then foster, crowd in, catalyze that kind of additionality of lots of different kind of possible solutions. Some might win, some might fail, towards the mission itself. So it's not just about giving money out to sectors or to small companies as ends in themselves, but because you actually have a mission that you're trying to solve. So an example would be starting with, climate change, which is SDG 13. With Europe, we talked about 100 carbon neutral cities in Europe by 2030. What would that mean for the ways that sectors as different as real estate, energy, mobility, construction, food, and so on would work together in different ways? And be supported, conditional on them actually having plans that had something to do with carbon neutrality. So if you have a public bank, you don't just give money to a sector. What are the conditions that you might have to make sure that a sector like steel actually reduces its material content? And these bubbles on the bottom, again, what does it mean for how we design procurement, grants, loans, bailouts, recovery schemes to foster that bottom-up experimentation towards the goals themselves? I also wrote a report for them on how to implement it, what it means for the flexibility and adaptability of our organizations, what it means for portfolio management of a government program instead of putting all your eggs in one basket. What does it mean for crowding in other forms of finance so you're not having to do it all by yourself, but also how to evaluate the program outside of just the question which market failure was fixed. What does it mean to go beyond cost-benefit analysis or net present value towards building indicators that are much more dynamic, that can capture all those spillovers, along the way that occur cross-sectorally? We don't really have good indicators of that in our ministries of finance or treasuries. In the UK, I helped to implement a new type of industrial strategy along these lines. So instead of picking sectors that would be supported, the idea was pick problems. They picked the healthy aging, future of mobility, clean growth, AI and the data economy as key challenges for the government. And then we helped them through a commission I set up through my institute to formulate missions under each one. So Future of Mobility had an interesting mission to make UK at the forefront of safe, sustainable, universally accessible travel, creating congestion and admission-free zero accident systems. It was a bit of a mouthful, but just the fact the word accessible travel was there meant that some of those bottom-up projects had to be in areas of disabilities. You see one of those bubbles, it's tiny there. It says 100% accessible public transport with equal access across all models. I also helped set up new types of financial institutions. There's plenty of finance out there. There's not enough patient finance, but sometimes development finance through public banks becomes part of the problem. Just giving out money to whichever sector lobbies its way up to the list of being seen as important. So what does it mean to design a public financial institution like a development bank with strong missions attached to it? So the loans are conditional on different types of companies or organizations that receive that lending to actually show that they are kind of being part of the solution to a problem that could be reduction of the digital divide, carbon neutrality, and so on. Similarly worked with the European Investment Bank on that, on the back of the 5 mission areas that Europe decided on the back of the report that I wrote for them. But let me just move on. In Sweden, what is really interesting, I'm sure you've heard about this concept again of stakeholder capitalism done structurally in places like Scandinavia, where they have workers on the boards of companies. But what's interesting in Sweden is that this notion of missions, they worked with us quite closely through my institute on it, and they have at this very high level a challenge for the whole government to have a fossil-free welfare state. And they land it on the really particular things like school meals. So school meals in Sweden, lunches, have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. So by having a target on what you're actually trying to do in public transport, public education, public health, and within public education, school lunch, it kind of comes back to that NASA idea of redesigning procurement to be, like challenge led, to then foster public-private partnerships, not through some false idea of this is going to be good for society because the private sector is great, but because you need to work together to create really interesting, innovative, sustainable, healthy, tasty school meals. That then becomes the driver of the contracts through which these different actors work together. Um, in Camden, which is the part of London where I live and work, I've been working very closely with my community leader. So Camden's leader is called Georgia Gould, wonderful woman, a labor leader. And we co-chair the Camden Renewal Commission, where this idea of a purpose, public value, mission orientation is being used to drive growth in this part of London. And what's interesting here, just to add something that I haven't talked about, is participation by people. So in cities and neighborhoods that are smaller than a nation state, it's easier also to bring different voices to the table so that we're not just a bunch of experts in the room telling people what to do, retrofit your homes, it's good, green. No, what Camden did, for example, through its clean growth mission, was first of all nest it within some housing estates, social housing, and I think in the US you call it more the projects, anyway, social housing, and then bringing people who live in social housing through the resident associations to the table to even discuss what these missions should be. What does it mean also to live together in a more sustainable way? So, to have a debate, a discussion, a contestation, a co-design, a co-creation of the missions themselves, which then Camden's economic policy would seek to deliver on, including, by the way, a new wealth fund that we're building in Camden, because it's part of London where Google and Facebook have all set up shop. There's also the British Museum, the British Library, the Wellcome Trust, the Turing Institute, my university. So there's a whole kind of knowledge creation machine, but a lot of that value in the past has been extracted out. So how do you actually capture some of this value, not only collectively create it, but collectively capture it to get reinvested back into the community through this wealth fund, but again, bringing this concept of missions to the center, but having true citizen engagement ex ante, not just ex post. Let me just move on. I'm almost done. So this guy here, who looks extremely serious, is the French finance minister. And this just brings up another issue, which is, I think, the last one I'll finish on, which is that, the whole concept of the Green Deal, the deal side, requires a new social contract. So this isn't just about mission setting and doing green and getting public and private, but rethinking the contracts is important. And what was interesting with this guy, the French finance minister, is that with COVID-19 recovery funds in France, he made it conditional that companies to receive those funds had to be kind of good companies. They had to commit, for example, to lowering their carbon emissions in the next 5 years. So Renault, the French car company, and Air France only received their bailout money by committing and signing up to a carbon reduction program. In Austria and Denmark, companies have had to agree to stop using tax havens, which is like, it's not rocket science, but that kind of conditionality within these public-private partnerships with a focus on a mission to, foster itself needs to be kind of, thought about, experimented with. And it's interesting how a lot of countries just don't do that. In the UK, we gave 600 million to EasyJet, one of our local airlines, no conditions attached, just because they were losing money during lockdown. So that's definitely a wasted crisis. And there's also this issue of conditionality that comes up with, healthcare. In the United States, the National Institutes of Health invest over $40 billion a year in health innovation, and yet the prices of our medicines don't reflect that. The intellectual property rights don't reflect that. And on the back of the health pandemic, where, again, the goal is to vaccinate everyone, backtrack on the economic design, this issue is extremely urgent, but it's also urgent in non-COVID periods. What does it mean to actually have a good deal? What should the prices be? Why doesn't the government introduce margin rights, so capping the prices of drugs that it's contributed to? All these questions are, again, very critical for rethinking the relationship, redesigning the relationship, coming back to the no excess profits clause of NASA. There's definitely excess profits in this sector. Excess meaning in excess of what should be earned given who's doing what, but also senses of justice. This isn't exactly a luxury item sector. It's an item, it's a sector where when people don't have the drugs, the medicines, they die. And it's just very interesting the power that the pharmaceutical industry has over the narrative of where innovation comes from. So any attempt to regulate the sector is fought back with, oh, but that'll stifle innovation, and how poorly prepared governments are to counter that argument, not just by saying, oh, but it's the right thing to do, you know, like Obamacare, it's the right thing to do, 60 million people uninsured. Obama should have said to the Tea Party, meddling in your health care, we produce 75% of drugs in the system through the NIH. Of course, you know, citizens should have access to that. I didn't say taxpayers, by the way, Stephanie. She's caught me out. Anyway, I do think this is very much an opportunity to uncover the kind of bullshit behind stakeholder value and give it real meaning, of how public and private and third sector institutions can truly work together to co-create value that actually has public goals at the center. So not only to direct the funds in a particular way, but also to keep quite open the how, you know, strong direction, open on the how, because micromanaging doesn't help, but a lot of attention on the design of the tools, the budgeting, the procurement, the intellectual property rights, and the kind of who gets what and why. In the last chapter of the book, I look at what this means for rethinking economics and the economy. And I kind of break it down into these issues of value as collectively created, markets as co-shaped and not just fixed in terms of the design of policy. All organizations, including public ones, need capabilities, which in many cases have been just decimated through all the history of outsourcing to McKinsey and others. Finance to be outcomes-based, money can be created. Like when we go to war, money literally is created to go to war. Why don't we think of it similarly for some of our more urgent problems and create an innovation system which also ensures there's that multiplier effect that I talked about? A perspective on inequality that's more pre-distributive, not just redistributive. Redistribution is good, especially when, well, it has to happen in a progressive way, but there's nothing to redistribute if we're also not creating wealth. And also creating it in a more just way, in that pre-distributive way. So a proper, you know, just relationship between not only capital and labor, but also public and private, who gets what and why. Partnerships to be purpose-oriented with stakeholder value, helping to design that. And this issue of participation, which I brought up in terms of what is sometimes easier to do at the city level, but new voices at the table. If we think about the importance of social movements in the history of capitalism, you know, we wouldn't have weekends without the labor movement. We needed the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and today, if we think of Black Lives Matter, we think of Me Too. These are all really important movements that should be used to shape and fundamentally change how we do capitalism. But that requires a much more open system that also allows those voices to be at the table in that participatory way instead of just reacting to the bad decisions made by others. And that's why this concept of missions should not be used as just a top-down decision by some minister, you know, having their pet projects. That really has to have that co-design and co-creation at the center. In the BC, British Columbia talk I just gave, they have a huge issue around structural racism with Indigenous community, and, you know, actually having true, genuine, not tokenistic opportunities for Indigenous communities to be at the table, to design their futures, to think about why it is we even need a public bank to do what. That co-creation is absolutely fundamental. So thank you. I am now at 50 minutes. I think that, oh God, how long did you tell me I had?
As long as you need it.
Oh, okay, good. I'm done.
Thank you. So we begin each Q&A with our speakers by asking the same question. So here it comes. Are you a capitalist?
Interesting. So, I mean, do I live like a capitalist? Yes. So do you, Stephanie.
Not the question.
Do I think that capitalism is the best of all systems? Definitely not. Do I think it's the system we have now? Yes. Do I think it can be radically, radically improved in a revolutionary way? It's not incremental. Yes. And I think it's the last point that, I've set up a whole institute, which is its own department. We actually have our own training program around these ideas because I actually believe that we can change things for the better. So if we had a better trained civil service, if we had tools like outcomes-oriented budgeting, if we actually cared to bring these different voices to the table to design our system in a better way, I actually think we'd have very different outcomes. Would it be a perfect system? No. But I think we can do it. And I think sometimes those who critique capitalism and are very good at critiquing it, unfortunately don't get their hands very dirty in improving it, so don't even have the humbleness or the time or the knowledge of what actually happens on the ground to bring back to the theory itself of how things work. So in trying to implement this new public bank in Scotland, I learned so much more than I could have ever learned in a book, a textbook about public banks. So we call this practice-based theorizing in my institute. So that patience and humbleness to actually work with policymakers and trying to design something for a couple of years, we need to be bringing it back to the theory of how we understand the system to be working or not working.
All right, I'm going to invite the class.
I dodged that.
Just 1 second. We have hands, yes. Can you see them?
Oh, you're going to call on people, right?
Yep, go ahead.
So I don't like Pfizer as well, for many reasons, but, because currently I'm working with a professor studying on HIV. And so I've read quite a bit from the WHO and UNAIDS. So I'm curious if you think those organizations or others like it should have political power to punish countries that hurt developing nations from getting medication, like how Pfizer controls antiviral medication for HIV in Africa and Central Asia. Sorry, that was a long question.
No, it's a really, really good question. So in the same way that we have sanctions now against Russia, should we have sanctions against countries or organizations that are basically committing crimes, right? Because people die. A lot of people die when we have the problems that you just talked about. So it's a criminal act. The problem is, I come back to the narrative. In fact, the book I wrote called The Value of Everything, I begin with Plato's quote, which is actually a Native American quote, which it's attributed for some reason to Plato. But anyway, it's more of a Native American quote, that storytellers rule the world. So the stories we tell about where innovation comes from in the health sector is not only completely false, but it's part of how then Pfizer has completely dismissed any attempt to regulate and change how we do intellectual property rights in the system, always with this threat, oh, it's going to mess us up, we're not going to be able to innovate because of that. So I do think that ideally these organizations would be able to create sanctions, but it's amazing how little they do even the most obvious thing, which is counter the narrative. They don't have that ability. And I think if you don't have that ability, you are poor in your capability. In the same way, by the way, I thought Obama was very, it was great. We started to get what was supposed to become proper Obamacare, but he had no ability to counter the narrative of you're meddling in our healthcare. He just had the social democratic response, even though in the US you don't really call it social democratic. But anyway, saying, it's the right thing to do. It's the just thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. Otherwise people literally, can't buy medicines. He should have complemented that. So it's not either or, complemented it with this idea that actually those drugs themselves come out of this massive collective value creation. So of course the state, which is funding it, should make sure that people can afford it. But similarly with the global south issue that you just mentioned, if you look at the conditionalities that have been imposed on many developing countries in order to receive World Bank and IMF loans in the past, often the conditions were actually reducing their fiscal space, reducing the capacity on the ground. So it's no wonder that even when they, are potentially given the ability to make vaccines, they don't have the capacity to do so. So that administrative capacity, the public sector capacity, which has been decimated in many countries on the back of, and this is how it relates to your course, ideology of what the state is for, ideology of where budgets come from, or ideology of why deficits should remain low, in order, as a condition to even get lending, development lending, has been part of the problem. So as much as I'd like to say, yes, they should have the ability to punish and to sanction, the first thing they should actually be doing is changing completely the conditionality linked to loans, and have a narrative about why regulation should happen on something like intellectual property rights. But that doesn't happen if they have no clue whatsoever on how to talk about wealth creation. And they just see themselves as redistributive.
Where was the other hand? Right here? Go ahead.
Okay, this is a little bit of a long one too, so I apologize in advance. But we listened to a Freakonomics podcast where you referenced China as one of the leaders in implementing a mission-oriented economy with regards to the climate crisis. And so I studied the Chinese energy sector for last semester, and a lot of their production is based on like hydroelectric power, which comes with its own problems, like siltation of reservoirs, like displacing local populations, etc. So how do we reorient our goals to make sure that a mission like carbon neutrality doesn't conflict with a wider goal of, like, say, environmental preservation?
Yeah.
And what are the sorts of things that international institutions can do to ensure that's the case?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I hope I didn't say what you said on the Chinese, on the podcast. I think what I said, because I always qualify it, is that China is learning the lessons, at least because I think I did that one before Biden was elected. So at the time we still had Trump, who was very mercantilistic. If you think of Trump's policies, very little industrial strategy. He cut a lot of the innovation spend. It was very mercantilistic in the sense of focus on exchange. He was trying to change the trade agreements. He was building walls, right? So, very similar to the navigation acts in the 1600s, where it was all about kind of exchange, as though exchange itself creates growth. So what I said was that China instead had a very active industrial strategy and active innovation policy, and was treating the climate emergency not only with urgency, but was creating huge amounts of money to go after it. So $2 trillion at the time, I think, of the podcast that I did, was being spent in China to create a more kind of sustainable production system. However, what I usually then say is that's not enough. What the US also had was this decentralized network of different public institutions, not just big kind of public banks or something like the CDB, the Chinese Development Bank, has given out huge loans, both to Huawei. I think Huawei got $8 billion in a guaranteed loan, but also to all the energy companies, but also that kind of portfolio setting. So you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. So not just doing hydroelectric dams or offshore wind somewhere else, or solar, but kind of a portfolio approach. And third, looking at the system, like, what does it mean? Because this is what you're saying. If you're investing in X, what does that actually do to kind of Y? That needs a kind of systems thinking that is, not very easy to do if you just have big funding and a big kind of inertial bureaucracy that thinks it could just throw a lot of money at a problem. And so I guess I'm just agreeing with you that in order to be truly mission oriented, not only does the mission have to be clear, but we need that kind of portfolio setting, coming back to that second report I wrote for the European Commission, flexible, adaptable, a portfolio setting. But also, if the mission is inclusive and sustainable growth, with the sustainability being designed through, say, carbon neutral cities and so on, the fact that it also has to be inclusive and sustainable, and putting in those words, like I said, put in 100% accessible travel in your future mobility system, making really clear that these missions have to be well thought out. So you're taking care of some, not only side effects and unintended consequences, but if you're not even taking into account the effect that it's having, some investments on other parts of the economy, that's just a very siloed thinking. And that's kind of what Gus Grissom and NASA was talking about, that when departments in government don't even talk to each other, when you have these silos where the health department doesn't talk to the climate change department, doesn't talk to the treasury, each one is doing its own thing, and then we stir up the soup and hope for the best. That doesn't work. but China definitely has been, until recently, this is pre-COVID, much more ambitious with creating finance to go after big problems like pollution. Um, then the how really, really matters. So if you're doing it just through hydroelectric dams or something, obviously that's going to create massive displacement and problems also around human rights. So you're absolutely right.
So during the whole period of like the moonshot, we went through 3 Democratic presidents. Congress was majority controlled by Democrats, a huge margin. The Western world was relatively united in the aftermath of World War II and the Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
There were clearly a lot of cultural differences between where they were then and where we are now, especially in the United States, where we still don't really have that much of a culture of collectivism. So my question to you is, has the US in particular lost touch with that kind of mission culture? Do you think that that sort of initiative has to be refostered, or do you think it's lying dormant and there's some sort of untapped potential for getting Americans to agree on a specific goal, a specific target, and allowing the federal government to pursue that target instead of debating it and placing restrictions and obstacles in the path of the government?
It's a super interesting question. I think you've touched on 2 different issues. One is the stability of government and administrations, but also consensus in society, right? So if you look at the extreme polarization we have today in the US, but also globally, I mean, look at the UK. We've just undergone this massive, stupid thing called Brexit, but it wasn't that stupid in terms of what people felt. It's really condescending for someone like me to say, oh, how stupid, we shouldn't have done Brexit. Or in the US, oh God, Trump voters are so idiotic. Well, no, people have felt really left behind. So globalization, technological change, financialization haven't exactly helped a lot of people, and they're mad, right? So, and that, anger then can take the form of all sorts of unfortunate characteristics, including intolerance versus some people that they think are the problem instead of, well, anyway, not everyone can take Stephanie's great classes or my great classes. Anyway, so that kind of anger and lack of consensus, we see this, of course, also in Ottawa, that lack of trust. It's actually also a trust issue. That has to be built. So at the same time that we do missions. So once you've lost that, once we've lost consensus, which by the way, even with the moon landing, it's not like there was all that consensus. There was that famous, wonderful poem and song by Gil Scott-Heron of Whitey on the Moon, spending all that money on Earth when you have all this poverty and racism and inequality on Earth. So there was a lot of contestation actually about the billions that were being spent on space when Earth just had all these social ills. Having said that, that's gotten much, much worse today. And so that's why I actually, and it's not an area I'm an expert on, I just recognize that it's an issue. I really believe that that participatory issue, bringing different voices to the table to co-design the missions, really matters to make sure that we're not just replacing one bad idea with another bad idea that then has the mission's lens on it. So, and it is easier in cities, I think, and that's why I've started to work a lot with mayors. I actually also got another council called Council and Urban Initiatives with Ricky Burdett from LSE Cities. It's hosted by UN Habitat, where we try to help mayors think about some of these ideas of mission orientation. But in cities, the ability to bring different people to the table to negotiate, to have a true kind of stakeholder governance process is easier surely than at the nation state. But I think we can learn from localities and then scale up the lessons at the national or even global level. But I think that trust building requires investment. I did a report, you can find it on Google. If you just Google my name and then UNDP, United Nations Development Program, and then IIPP, the name of my institute, we did a report on capabilities in governments on the back of COVID-19, and we looked at who did well. And we found that places like Vietnam and Kerala, part of India, did actually much better than many developed countries because on the back of previous health crises they had, pandemics like the Nipah virus, they realized that if there wasn't trust between citizens, government, academia, and business, it would just all fall apart. But that didn't happen just by saying, "Oh, let's go pray and let's hope everyone trusts us." They went through a process of building that trust, and also went through a process of strengthening their public procurement and public administration at that tool level. But the trust issue was really important. And I just think there's something coming back to the movements point, where we have all these social movements today, Fridays for the Future, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. They shouldn't just be seen as these things out there that are kind of protesting. We need to bring them in to these ideas. If you want to build back better, build forwards better program, which, you know, Biden says he has, who's deciding what's good? Who's deciding what's better? Whose voices are at the table? And I think to build that trust, we need to show we're serious about bringing new voices. So it's not just, you know, the elite, a couple academics, a couple businesses, a couple policymakers in places like Davos.
Do you want to, sure. All the way in the back, you're going to have to speak real loud.
So my question is a little bit of an extension to this. So it's quite clear that there's been success with your idea of like mission economy and mission oriented internationally. But how do you like intend to, like in the United States, how do you intend to convince people or kind of get this implemented that mission orientation is like really like one of the best ways to solve our like market problems when people are ignoring history and data, and I mean, to use your metaphor of the moon, like people still don't believe that the moon landing even happened here. How do you get your mission orientation to really like go, you know?
Yeah, I mean, so again, really good question. I wish I was there with you guys. It would be fun to go for a drink.
too.
Go out for a drink afterwards, and think about this together. Well, actually, it's too early for you guys. I can go out for a drink given the time here. It's coming on to 7:30. So I think there's two different points. One is the US does do mission orientation, but just with military. And by the way, when they do it, I don't want to say well, but they take care. So DARPA, which, you know, funded the internet, also funds health because soldiers get sick on the battlefield. DARPA, when it funds health issues, takes care to make sure that the soldiers on the battlefield have access to the drugs that Pfizer or whoever might have produced, you know, with some sort of procurement. Why don't we do that with the NIH, which puts in 40 billion? We don't then make sure that people have access to what, you know, the public has paid for. So it's, you know, now it's a separate question what the mission should be, right? I mean, so the first thing is when war is the mission, the US does it. They create the money, they have the capacity inside, at least until recently. I actually think there's a bit of a hemorrhaging of capacity even within NASA. I did a report for them about this, you know, all the kind of, you know, talk about Elon Musk being the great innovator in space. It's all on the back of huge amounts of public investments. He got 5 billion from the US government for his 3 companies, never managed to say thank you. But that narrative that it's all about private entrepreneurs is actually depressing a lot of the top scientists who are like, you know what, I'm out of here. If that's the narrative, if I'm here just to facilitate Elon Musk, I'd rather go to Stanford. So forget that just for a minute. But the US does do mission orientation in the military. It doesn't do it on its social problems. It always pretends there's not enough money, except during a crisis, right? Then you have a pandemic and all of a sudden we've got money even around some social/health issues. But unless it's proper spending with, you know, ambitious organizations as much in health as we have in defense, the level not only of ambition but effectiveness isn't there. I actually just wrote, you can find it in Project Syndicate, an article this week on why the US should have an ARPA-H, like DARPA, but for health, and what that would look like. That kind of design thinking and care to implement in our more social areas what we've done in the military. It's not that the US has no idea that this is important. It just then doesn't, like many countries, I think it's just as true internationally, they don't spend the time to do it properly, right? So even this huge amounts of, the trillions that are coming out of the woodwork in the US administration, if it's just seen as helicopter money, forget the fact it might not be enough. Even if it was enough, you can't just throw money into the system and hope for the best. We need structures on the ground. And I think, unfortunately, it's not just the US that kind of doesn't get it. Globally, this is really the big challenge. You might have a progressive government. Latin America has many progressive governments, but they've often just thought you could do this through redistribution, just give money to poor people, and somehow that's going to be a great progressive agenda. If it's not linked to a very fundamentally different way to create wealth, there's again nothing to redistribute. But also, if it's not complemented with new thinking within the civil service, then it's really hard to get better policies that last. And so my ambition in the US, I'm actually going to the, I'll be there in April for a couple of weeks. I'll be giving a talk to the CEA, the Council of Economic Advisors, and the NEC, National Economic Council or something, around some of these issues, like lessons learned globally from mission orientation, so we don't waste the trillions that are coming out of the woodwork in the US, as though you can just kind of spread it around a bit and hope for the best. So we'll see. Hopefully it'll be useful.
Can I squeeze in one question before you?
Yeah.
We have like 2 minutes, so this is a question I want them to hear the answer to, and I want to hear the answer too. In one of the pieces that you sent us, or one of the video links, I can't remember which, I think it was the concluding chapter to the latest book. You talk about, governments aren't supposed to be picking winners and losers. It's about picking the willing, and you talk about picking the willing, and you talk about, a guy like JFK giving this speech and laying out the mission, and then inviting a coalition of the willing, come aboard, right? Help us in the ways that you can. You innovate, you create, and together we will carry out the mission. So I'm wondering about carrots and sticks, basically. If you're committed to getting the mission accomplished, one way or another, and the carrots aren't doing the job, right? And what part of what you talk about is through procurement. You say you want companies to make a profit. You can't say do this out of charity. So you gotta have a profit, not an excessive profit. And I'm just thinking, okay, so companies here, there's a little something for you in it, but not a windfall. And you don't have to do it, but we're asking you to do it. And so right now, Biden is out there saying to fossil fuel companies, you have the permits and you have the federal land, but you're not increasing production, and we need more oil. And so he's kind of starting to threaten them with the stick a bit today. And he'll do that in a speech that's taking place, I think, just in the last hour. So the question is, is the pitch? What would a presidential Kennedy-like moonshot speech say around climate change or whatever today? What would it sound like, and how would it appeal to the business community to come aboard the willing, to bring the willing in?
So I can't do that in less than 1 minute, but I think there's two issues that you've brought up. One is the one I kind of already mentioned, which is, that speeches cannot begin by pretending stuff is easy. I mean, just the fact he began by saying, we're doing this because it's hard, not because it's easy, meant that public and private had to embrace that difficulty together, as opposed to seeing one facilitating the other, de-risking the other. As soon as one side is de-risking the other, you can bet one side's getting screwed in the process, right? We're just gonna, make things easier by reducing your tax, by giving you a tax incentive. That kind of carrots actually is one of the key drivers of inequality. People talk about tax a lot, but they don't look at the actual taxes that are out there. So R&D tax credits are one of the key ways that the pharmaceutical industry has increased its profits without it having any effect on its investment. So when I write about that kind of issue that you've just talked about, sticks and carrots, I say the first thing to do is stop talking about leveling the playing field, right? This is about tilting the playing field, not tilting it in a way that you say, I'm going to give you money, as though you know everything, but tilting it by saying, I'm going to choose a direction. If this would be sustainable growth, I'm going to have a whole tax structure, which is not about raising income, as you rightly always say. The government doesn't need to raise tax in order to spend, but it does need to use the taxation system to incentivize good behavior. We currently tax labor more than we tax materials. That doesn't help you dematerialize the economic system, right? Or, you know, we just did a study with Spain on how you can use the Sustainable Development Goals seriously to restructure tax incentives for companies that would get a tax reduction if they are truly, you know, working towards achieving particular types of metrics around the SDGs. So it's not just about like procurement, you know, some money in order if you're going to help us go after a reduction of the digital divide. It's using the kind of all of government approach, the full of government levers, from taxation to the procurement, to the ways that we're doing budgeting, to the conditionalities. That's a lot of stuff one has to have one's eye on, but that's not what you put in the speech because people fall asleep by the time you're done. But the fact that you're doing, you know, we're going to go after climate change because it's hard, not because it's easy. A, B, and it's urgent, and explain why it's urgent. The cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. Also with COVID-19, the cost of not spending today in strengthening our health systems when the next virus comes, and it will, as the permafrost melts, many viruses are going to be coming our way. The cost of not, you know, of not acting today is much greater in the future because we're going to have a much longer lockdown, right? So using even just really simple cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action narrative, but also evidence from both COVID and climate, I think is very important. But that issue of working together to solve this problem, but working together means getting the right deal. So we're not just going to give you a bunch of handouts. We're going to help you, but we're going to help you because you are willing, and we'll help you be more capable. But if you're not willing, you aren't going to get help. My experience is that with the top companies, they want that, because the problem is when you don't talk like that, you end up spreading support to all the companies, like all SMEs. By the time the SMEs get it, who are actually interested in innovation, in, you know, solving problems, it's too little money because they've just spread it across the whole category through this false notion that you want to help small companies versus help the small ones that really want to engage with really important challenges, whether they're digital, energy, health, and so on.
Perfect. Thank you again. Enjoy your daughter. Let's catch up.
Bye-bye. Yeah,
right.
and Stephanie, I only recently saw one of your messages, so I'll reply to it. It was
Yeah. Okay.
Bye.
Let's
Bye,
catch
bye,
up.
bye, bye. Ciao, bye.